Grid Alliance is a proud sponsor of Public Power Underground, a subsidiary of NextEra Energy and the leading transmission company in North America. Grid Alliance is a transmission-only utility company that's more than just wires. With operations in 3 regional transmission organizations, Grid Alliance works with electric cooperatives and municipal utilities to create collaborative solutions that integrate renewable energy and improve the reliability and resiliency of the electric grid. Learn more at gridliance.com. That's gridliance.com.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without.
On Public Power Underground, we talk about the energy enthusiasm trifecta of electrifications, markets, and people. On today's episode, we're discussing transmission planning, transmission investment, and transmission policy with 3 transmission experts. A transmission topic trifecta. I'm Paul Dockery, a Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light.
And I'm Crystal Ball, the Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee. PNUC. All right, joining Paul and me is Rich Glick. Rich is a principal with GQ New Energy Strategies, a consulting firm he co-founded with Pamela Quinlan. When we last interviewed Rich on Public Power Underground, he was chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. As chair, Rich initiated several reforms to more efficiently and cost-effectively accommodate the evolution of the electric grid. Before being appointed to FERC, Rich was general counsel for the Democrats on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He has worked for Iberdrola, PPM Energy, and Pacificor, and as an associate in a law firm. He also advised U.S. Energy Secretary Bill Richardson and U.S. Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas. Rich, you are also known in the West for your current work with the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, CREPC. Welcome, Rich.
Thanks very much, Crystal. Appreciate you inviting me.
So last time you were on, Rich, you had just come off some training for like PR training, media training at FERC. Did you get some training from Pamela before coming on here about how to handle podcasts?
I was going to say that maybe when people listen to the last podcast, I'm sure they know that I didn't do a very good job in the media training, but still working on it.
You did great on both the media training and also we got you to break loose a little bit. It was fun. I think having Crystal around helps you break loose a little bit because it seems like you've known each other.
That's true for a few years.
And I think the last time we even developed some new merch for the podcast.
Energy enthusiast merch, actually, because right. You like all energy, as I recall. Yep, that's great. It was great. Maybe
new merch for today's episode.
That'll be the goal. That'll be a standard we have to meet. Joining Crystal, Rich, and I is Pamela Quinlan. Hi, Pamela. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you have co-founded GQ New Energy Strategies with Rich. I'm going to read some of your bio here. You can correct any of the biographical errors I put into the script as we go if you want. Pamela is an expert in energy market regulation and policy. She started at FERC as a senior energy industry analyst in the Office of Energy Market Regulation. In 2017, Quinlan went to work in the then Commissioner Glick's office as a technical advisor and was appointed chief of staff in January 2021. As chief of staff, she was responsible for developing and implementing the strategy behind the commission's policy initiatives. Before leaving FERC in 2023, Quinlan advised Chair Willie Phillips on energy markets and resource adequacy, a favorite topic of Public Power Underground. She also worked for Consolidated Edison, Con Ed, and Standard & Poor's. Welcome to Public Power Underground, Pamela.
Thanks so much.
Did you listen to our first recording with Rich? Do you know what you're getting into?
I did. I always think podcast editing is wonderful, and I thought Rich sounded great. So hopefully the editing is kind this time too.
And we did have to edit. It was coached like live that we had to cut something out. He didn't even say anything, and we had to cut it out. Maybe we'll put out a bloopers reel. That'd be fun.
Now we can. Unfiltered Rich Glick.
You can see that if you go back and watch old webcasts of commission meetings, you can see Rich's bloopers reels live.
I love that.
Awesome. All right. Lastly, a beloved guest and dare we say close friend of the underground, Professor Jacob Mays. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks for having me back.
Professor Mays is an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University, where his research focuses on the design and analysis of electricity markets. His seminal work on the sequential pricing of electricity was the subject of a standalone episode on season 5 of Public Power Underground, and his collaborations with Jesse Jenkins, Farhad Bilamore, and Ramat Pudne have informed our listeners' perspectives on electric markets under deep decarbonization. You can find links to those prior appearances in the show notes. Professor Mays holds an AB in chemistry and physics from Harvard University, a master's in engineering in energy systems from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in industrial engineering and management sciences from Northwestern University. While Professor Mays, you get around in your education pursuits. Welcome back to Public Power Underground, Professor Mays.
Thanks for having me.
Does it feel right to be a close friend of Public Power Underground? Does that feel right?
I think that's right. What doesn't feel right is calling any paper I've written seminal. Because
it is.
I mean, it's like from last year. You can't call it seminal yet until it's like kind of survived the test of time.
This is me like telegraphing into the future. Like
Sure.
The foresight. I have the foresight to understand that is a seminal work on sequential pricing of electricity.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Yes, that's the enthusiasm we have for that research topic. So FERC Order 1920 was released on May 13th, 2024. We're recording on June 12th, which is a month afterwards. We have had some time to digest. Our experts have had some time to digest. It also happens, I just happened across Twitter this morning and saw that it's the deadline for filing requests for rehearing about the rule. The purpose of our recording today is to try to consider not just FERC Order 1920, but also the state of transmission investment and whether the order takes meaningful steps toward advancing the deployment of grid infrastructure. And we're going to do that like through the frame of 3 questions. We're going to ask each of our experts what they were hoping for in advance of the rule. We're going to ask if it does what they wanted, like if the thing they hoped for was accomplished through the rule. And lastly, we're going to end on what was missing. And I really do think these 3 experts will provide like some really interesting perspectives on those 3 lenses about not only like Rich with what you were hoping for having started this whole process, but also getting to, at the end, some insights into like what in theory is missing and what in practice may be missing from that final rule. And then we're going to close it out with grand analogies for the energy system, where our guest experts get to possibly submit an analogy into our Energy System Analogies World Cup tournament. But to get started with what everybody was hoping for, I'm going to hand it off to Crystal.
All right. And as Paul mentioned, we are starting with what you were hoping for. And we're starting with you, Rich. Now, Rich, you served at FERC between 2017 and 2023, and you chaired the commission from 2021 until 2023. During your time there, FERC's transmission agenda was focused on building more transmission capacity to increase the resilience and reliability of the grid. While you were chair, the commission began the journey to Order 1920, issuing first an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANOPR, in July 2021, and second, a notice of proposed rulemaking, or NOPR, in April 2022. That NOPR considered reforms to facilitate the development of new electric transmission infrastructure. And FERC's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan that you issued as chair in March 2022 envisioned implementing these reforms. You also convened the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmission, a first of its kind effort to ensure important cooperation between federal and state regulators via partnership between FERC and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC. And that was on electric transmission related issues, a clear indication of your prioritization on collaboration with state regulatory bodies on transmission issues. So with all of that context, getting back to the question, Rich, when FERC started on the path to Order 1920, what were you hoping for?
Oh, thanks for the question, Crystal. And when you put it that way, I think back on the entire process, and it obviously takes a long time. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned from regulatory agencies. Based on a variety of legal and regulatory requirements, it just takes a lot longer than you expect. Because when we spoke last, which I believe was in 2022 on this podcast, I was very much hoping we can get it done in a couple months, and obviously it took the commission a lot longer. But it's not. It just was just a matter of building the record and making sure you have a sufficient record. I think in general, as you know, and this has been becoming an increasingly important issue over the last 5, maybe even 10 years, there's a much broader recognition around the country about the need for massive investments in new transmission capacity, whether it be to access new generation resources, whether it be to achieve various state and federal policies, as well as corporate goals on reducing emissions, whether it be to make the grid more reliable, and whether it be to make the grid more resilient against extreme weather, which we see occurring much more frequently, especially out west, with extreme heat and forest fires and other things like that. And so, I think there's enough of a consensus now around the country that we need a lot more transmission. And the question is, what do you have to do to get there? And one of the things was, I think people recognize there were really 3 barriers to transmission. And I know Rob Gramlich has been a guest on your podcast, and he does a great job in promoting a variety of issues related to transmission. And he always refers to the 3 Ps, which is planning, who plans for transmission, who pays for transmission, and who permits transmission. And those clearly are the 3 barriers. And at FERC, the commission doesn't have significant amount of authority as it relates to permitting. At least it didn't at the time. It does now. We can talk about that in a bit. But the commission has much more authority with regard to the planning and the pay for part, the cost allocation part. And so our goal was really to try to figure out how to eliminate some of the barriers, or at least address some of the barriers to transmission investment. And it had been very clear, especially on the transmission planning side, that why Order 1000 that FERC issued well over a decade ago now was well-intentioned and really, and in many cases made some strides towards improving the way we plan for transmission on a regional basis. There were a number of barriers, and in large part, we weren't necessarily planning in an anticipatory manner, meaning where is the generation going to be? How do we make sure we build the transmission to access that new generation? Or we weren't necessarily planning on a holistic basis. Instead, we were planning to deal with reliability issues, or planning to deal with economic issues, or planning to deal with state policy issues, but doing that all separately. And it doesn't make any sense, because lots of transmission projects provide benefits in more than one area. And so what we had set out in originally the ANOPR is to essentially request and seek comments on how can we do planning better. And it was, to me, the comments that came in after the ANOPR and after the NOPR with the notice of proposed rulemaking as well, pretty much strongly identified the need to really to take drastic steps to improve the way we regionally plan for transmission. Again, anticipatory, taking the blinders off and addressing some of the other barriers to transmission planning. And that was one of our major goals, is to really shake up the way regional transmission planning occurred around the country. The second issue being the paying for part. That has always been a huge impediment. It's very difficult in many cases to convince whether it be state regulators or utilities or customer groups that they should pay for X amount for new transmission facilities, even if they benefit significantly. And so the commission set out in the NOPR and eventually Order 2023 to figure out a way to better allocate the cost of transmission in a way that's fair, that's commensurate with benefits, which the law requires, and does it in a way that won't act as an impediment to the development and transmission. And I know I'm going on for a while here. I just want to make one last point. You mentioned the state task force that FERC and NAWRC jointly created, which is still ongoing, is my understanding. That task force, the real intent of that was really to make sure that there's an understanding both at FERC and at the state level that this is a partnership, that states have a number of tools that they're, that they could use, and FERC does as well. And it's important that they all be on that, to the extent possible, states and FERC be on the same page, especially as it relates to who pays for transmission, because if states don't like the way that costs are allocated on transmission, it's going to be much more difficult to actually get that facility built.
I like it. We've added a fourth P here with partnership. So we have the permitting, paying, planning, and partnering with states, and maybe even those public-private partnerships too.
That's
Well,
a good way. I hadn't thought about it.
Well, we'll text Rob after this and let him know there's 4 Ps now. Rich says there's 4 Ps. Pamela, I'm curious to get a follow up on Rich's, and I'm glad you could give that comprehensive answer, Rich. Really appreciate that. And Pamela, just wanting your thoughts, like you were there, you were helping, you were getting these visions of grandness from Rich, and then you were, I think, tasked with like, how do I actually manage this process? That's what I think you did. Is that right? And what else were you hoping for?
I think that's right, although I'd be remiss not to mention Liz Salerno, who I think led these efforts. We were very grateful to have somebody so talented to put in charge at FERC to get these kicked off. But I think, when you step into the role and into the chairman's office and trying to figure out what to do with FERC, like there's so many different challenges facing the industry. But I think, as Rich said, by and large, there's increasing agreement that we're just not prepared to meet the future if we don't build the infrastructure that's needed. And I think when you look at what Order 1000 did, and there was high hopes for it, and there's lots of reasons why Order 1000 didn't meet people's expectations. But I think that a very key part of that is that when you look at benefits of transmission in these really siloed, limited ways, it becomes really hard to do anything that's longer term. And that results in these shorter term projects, and shorter term projects are, like, if you're meeting shorter term reliability needs, inherently have to be smaller in scale and more localized. And we saw a lot of, what we called thickening of the grid, and, combine that with all the aging infrastructure that's out there. We weren't seeing the kind of proactive planning. And there was, the record was tremendously helpful. And FERC staff put unknown hours going through that record and talking to people to understand the realities on the ground. And I think taking a longer look and really thinking about how the grid gets used, who benefits from it, what all the different things that it does, rather than building it piecemeal and short-term bases and expecting individual generators to be the ones that go online and open up huge amounts of the grid through upgrades, was a really inefficient way to build it out. So I think that was the idea behind it. I agree with all of what Rich said. And then I think, rulemakings, I know everyone wishes they were, can be done overnight, but they need to be legally durable and really thoroughly answer the comments to it. And FERC staff did, I think, an excellent job. And I'm really just excited that they got the 1920 over the finish line.
We're very familiar with process out here in the Northwest, aren't we, Crystal? So this felt right. Like we knew when Rich said it was going to be a couple months, like, I don't know. Notice and comment timelines tend to drag on at federal agencies. I wanted to follow up on one thing, Pamela. So in like your thoughts, was the benefits, like benefit analysis in those categories, is that part of really what you were hoping for? And like defining the benefits in a very broad and well, I guess a broad way. I would consider it.
Yeah, and the longer term, right? Like those two things go hand in hand, because without it, if you look, you can't really. It takes a really long time to build infrastructure, and there's a lot of efforts to like speed up permitting, but it takes a long time to build that out, and we need to be able to really think more than 3-5 years in advance to think through how we can actually build out the grid to support it. And there's always going to be unknowns, but there are certain things that we can build in, and I think that's where, as part of benefits, you also think about scenarios. So there's not one future, there's a lot of variability, but the variability can't be a reason that we can't move forward. The variability gives us ranges to understand solutions and help identify which projects are the best ones to move forward. But up until you change kind of the regulations around doing this, that uncertainty, the inherent uncertainty, the further out you go, is just reason to not build. And I think that just kind of resulted in the breakdown of really being able to have kind of a robust transmission plan.
I heard you say proactive transmission planning, and that proactive transmission planning just doesn't really happen, especially in the West.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's another P. But I think that, proactive, part of that's because of P, and I think the challenge when you start to go further out, and I think we're going to see this as regions start to think through how they're going to do this, when you start to really move towards this longer term, is how do you address that uncertainty? There's a huge cost, there's a huge price tag associated with really large infrastructure projects. And that's where I think really digging into understanding the different types of benefits and then thinking through the scenarios of what if load is higher, what if load is lower, and what if, different electrification futures can help build comfort and support. And the other part of that, which Rich mentioned, is that, I think there was a really strong recognition certainly by Rich and I think by FERC staff and the team that we worked on with this, that if we don't have the state's buy-in on what we're doing, it's going to be really hard to get anything built. And I think that's why there was such a focus from the beginning on bringing them into the conversation and what would need to be done so that they can be supportive, that these are the right things to help bridge us to the future and be able to proactively plan.
Well, that's actually a great segue to asking Jacob what you were hoping for out of this rule, because it's like there is an uncertain future, and you just released a paper on ambiguity and transmission benefits. Can you, stepping back to just the first question of what were you hoping for? In what way can FERC actions lead on these topics, Jacob?
Sure. So I think kind of like Rich and Pamela said, the academic literature in general has kind of been coming out with these analyses over the past decade saying, hey, it would be beneficial from economics, reliability, policy standpoint to have a lot more transfer capacity than we have now. But a lot of the academic and national lab studies are kind of pipes and bubbles type analyses, not fine-grained enough to really tell how that translates into kind of real world benefits. And so I think, at a high level, one thing I was really hoping for is to say, let's actually put those to the test and say, can we do these translate into material benefits in the real world? On the kind of another branch of academia, the regulatory economics type literature has pointed out that the incentives in terms of existing transmission investment are just all off. And so this is kind of what Pamela was talking about, where there's this clear push toward local reliability projects, kind of the shorter term things, and away from the regional level and interregional level planning. And so we haven't necessarily had underinvestment in transmission, but we've certainly had misallocated investment away from the regional to the smaller local types of lines. And then there's all sorts of these process issues with funding network upgrades through the interconnection queue and things like that don't make a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things. So I think that writ large, what I was hoping for was the recognition of that and to push in the direction of more regional planning and less local, and more long-term and less short-term, and with respect to uncertainty in particular, since it came up, and I solve stochastic optimization models. So this is near and dear to my heart. I think that the recognition that uncertainty isn't a reason not to make a decision. You're just making a different decision if you just decide not to do anything, and that's not really a valid way of going about things. So I think that kind of general shift away from local toward regional and shift away from shorter term to long term is both are both in what I was hoping for. The other thing that was also mentioned is that having this distinction between reliability and economic and public policy and interconnection as 4 different avenues for having transmission investment. If you solve a transmission planning model, it's very clear to you, like every project has an effect on all 4. It's not like we can just say this is a reliability project and it's not going to have any effect on economics. And so it's never made a lot of sense to me to have those silos, both in terms of the planning processes and then also in terms of the cost allocation. And so having that kind of multi-value logic built into the order was something I was hoping for.
You know, I was thinking about this a lot in preparation for interviewing these experts, and I was thinking about how transmission happens now. And it feels like a lot of it happens in that interconnection process, and that it has become an ill-suited place where grid planning takes place, especially, I think, here in the Pacific Northwest. And so that's kind of how I think about it, is how does it happen now and how could we improve it so that we get these longer term, wider region planning approaches. And it seems like that's what the order is intended to do.
Yeah, if I can touch on that just for a second. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about that at FERC because, as you know, the commission also recently issued a order number 2023, another different number, but dealing with reforming the generator interconnection process. And, you know, we talked about priorities and which do you move first and so on. And, you know, it was finalized in a different order, but the reason we spent some time originally talking just about planning and cost allocation was because the notion is that if you fix the planning and cost allocation problem, get transmission built through that process, then the interconnection process will be much less complicated, in large part because you won't need as many network upgrades, where your point is a lot of times transmission is now being built through the generator interconnection process, which in my opinion is neither efficient nor fair. And instead, if you already have the transmission built out, it's a lot easier for generators to plug in without worrying about the cost of network upgrades.
You had mentioned a little bit earlier as well, like, so 2023 was generator, 1920 is transmission planning, cost allocation, and then there's also 1977 that talks about permitting. Do you want to just touch on how that falls into this overarching ANOPR and NOPR? I don't remember if it comes out of the same process that you also get 1977, or if it was a separate process to get towards that permitting.
It was a separate process in large part because Congress several years ago in the bipartisan infrastructure bill clarified that FERC has expanded authority to engage in what they call backstop transmission siting. So if you have a transmission line located in a national interest electric corridor designated by the Department of Energy, and the state says no, or a state acts in another way or doesn't act even to block, and because of that project to be blocked, then the transmission developer can then come to FERC and say, I want you to essentially approve the project even if the state said no. And so 1977 was essentially a rulemaking designed to implement that particular statutory responsibility.
Nice, thank you. So you mentioned 2023, which I think the commission released while you were chair. I don't know. No, you weren't there. Crystal is shaking her head no. We're going to cut this out. Right.
Okay. I apologize. It was proposed while we were there, but it was finalized.
The final rule on 2023 was issued and numbered by Willie Phillips.
Okay, so we're going to leave this in because, frankly, everybody knows that I make mistakes all the time and am frequently wrong. But the question: did you ever get to number an order, and what would you have numbered? How would you have named the 1920 FERC order if you were still chair? Because that's this is a whole thing that I think I'm just coming to. The chair numbers the order, and at the start of the meeting on 1920, Chair Phillips does a really good job of explaining why he numbered it. And I'm really curious, if you were there, what would you have numbered it?
So we talked about this a little bit, obviously during the preliminary stages, but and I had jokingly suggested maybe making it order 1 million, so that would sound very important. But no, obviously it's up to the chair at the time when the rule is finalized to determine the number. And I think you had it exactly right. I thought he explained it very well.
Well, for people who don't know, why is it called 1920?
So 1920 was the year in which Congress first enacted Title I of the Federal Power. Title I actually deals with hydropower licensing and operation, but it also formed, I guess, the original Federal Power Commission, which was the precursor to FERC. And so the notion was it goes back to FERC's origins.
And there's a lot of historians at FERC, which is where I would, in some of the general counsel's office, where I suspect this idea probably came from, although I certainly can't confirm it. But I could say that those same people would probably have pitched pretty hard to Rich if he was chair that he should take some kind of approach like that. So, it's always interesting. It's up to the chairman. We saw Neil Chatterjee. His family has an affinity for the number 2 or 22, and that's where we got, 2222, or sometimes called the 2x4 rule. So you never know what people are going to do with it. I think after order number 2023 on interconnection, which was issued in 2023, I might have just called it order 2024 because then they kind of go together. But I also know that folks found that really confusing, and there was actual tweets asking FERC not to call it 2024. So, it's a hard decision.
Yeah, but back to the origin, and then the order we just mentioned on order 1977. Why is it called 1977?
So 1977 was the year in which the Federal Power Commission became FERC, pursuant to a series of energy bills that were enacted at the time, including the DOE Organization Act, that were enacted under the Carter administration.
And that's when we got FERC.
That's right.
I feel like you kind of dodged the question. So I'm going to reframe the question. If you were to number this after a famous baseball player, what famous baseball player number would you use for this order? How about that?
Well, if I had to do that, I would number it order number 41, because that was Tom Seaver's number. But I can explain later my affinity for the Mets when we talk about sports analogies, or I should say energy analogies.
Okay, so that's a great pivot and a great preview, like foreshadowing of the rest of the conversation. So stick around for that explanation. We're going to pivot to talk more about, does this do what you wanted? And we talked about the need to go from short-term to long-term, from local to regional is kind of the overarching goals I think I heard from all of you. I'm going to turn to you, Pamela, in thinking about whether this does what you were hoping for. To frame it up, I'm gonna use another podcast and another podcast appearance by someone we've already mentioned, Rob Gramlich. He was on Volts. I'll use a link in the show notes where he talks about this order with David Roberts, the host of Volts, and he used a one sentence to describe the 1,300 pages of the order. He says, it quotes, "Plans for the future with the best available information, select the best plan for consumers, and allocate costs according to benefits," unquote. That's his one sentence summary of what this does. Pamela, you were at FERC during all of this. Does this accomplish what you were hoping for? Does it do what you wanted?
I think it does. I'm really very happy with where Order 1920 came out. I think, folks were certainly hoping for, unanimous order being issued. I think the risk of that is it would have lost kind of some of the meat that is necessary to have it be successful. And I really am happy with where it came out, requiring 20-year planning with scenarios and defined benefits. I think if you look through the record, which a lot of us have, I think these were the major things that needed to be there. And I think that that I'm really grateful that they managed to get that all in there and move it across. And it still has this really important kind of unprecedented role for the states to provide input. And I think we haven't lost that priority, which, as I said, is from the beginning, the states need to be included and be on board for this to be successful. And I think this breaks new ground for them to be able to have an important role. So I think 1920 really hit the mark on what it needed to do. But now I think it matters what people do with it, because I think the rubber hits the road on compliance filings and how people interpret what this says, and they put it into their actual tariffs and their actual plans. And we need to make sure that that gets done consistent with what this rule is trying to do. But I think the regs are right.
Can I dig a little bit deeper? I don't think I prepped you for this, so we can cut it in post if it's an unfair question. But there were a few things that changed from the NOPR to the final rule. One of them being, I think the right of first refusal was in the NOPR considered like possibly being reintroduced. The right of first refusal that got taken away. Taken away is maybe the wrong word, not framing it right, under Order 1000, but a possibility of having some limited ROFR. There was also more, I think, benefits in the initial NOPR. I think it went from 12 to 7, something like that. Can you just give your take on, I gave some examples, but if you were thinking about the changes between even the ANOPR to the final rule or the NOPR, what did it do anything that you were hoping, cut anything you were hoping really to get through?
I think the ROFR issue that you teed up is an interesting one. I think, bringing in competition into Order 1000, there's a lot of really strong opinions on this and a lot of competing studies as to whether it saves money or doesn't save money. What I can say rather confidently is that it certainly didn't work out the way people wanted it to. And it matters how you kind of can try to fix that going forward. So I think what we teed up in the proposed rule on kind of the joint ownership as a way to bring this in is to explore an idea of ways to kind of maybe address some of the underlying incentive, like or misaligned incentives that kind of undermine some of the potential benefits that we thought would be seen in Order 1000. I think that the blowback received about it made it really hard in the record to kind of move that forward. But the right sizing in the final rule still has that's an expansion of the ROFR rights, and that's there. And so there is a little bit of it there. I can understand, given the kind of pushback that people received, that FERC didn't move forward with it. So I wasn't surprised that that's where it went, and I don't think that that's critical to its success. And I don't know that if I was there, I would recommend doing anything different. So I think on the ROFR, that was probably the right way to move forward. And in terms of the benefits, sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on one thing, because you used the term right sizing, and I wanted to just unpack that, because I do think it's an interesting element in here. And before we move past, I did want to go a little bit deeper. So right sizing is like reconductoring and upgrading existing transmission infrastructure to using existing infrastructure. Is that what right sizing was? Or are we cutting this also in post because I got it wrong?
No, I think right sizing is not an official term, right? I mean, maybe it is now more because it's in the rule, but I think in general, and Rich, jump in, but I think in general, and we've seen this happen, is like, if you already have that right of way, if it's already at a certain, if you already think there's support in the shorter term for a smaller line, like a bigger line, or there's different ways in which you can increase transmission capacity within that existing right of way, or where there is existing infrastructure to meet future needs. And if that is the type of project, that would be the one that would be subject to the ROFR.
I think the commission said in Order 1920, if you have a project that's, I think it's 200 kilovolts or higher, but of a certain size, and a transmission project that's actually going to, its useful life is going to come to a conclusion within the next 10 years. Maybe the approach is to, if you're going to have to do something to extend the life of that project, why don't you expand the capacity of that line? It's going to be cheaper. Obviously, the area's already been sited, so it's a lot easier to site the project. It'll be easier to get whatever you need to do in terms of the rights of way to build out the project. And so FERC said, well, because it's going to be the same utility that has the line that's going to extend the life of the project, they essentially already are going to have a right of first refusal, because they're going to be able to build that project anyway. So FERC just clarified that it wouldn't eliminate the right of first refusal for right sizing those types of projects.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. Yeah, so that is an element where the right of first refusal does kind of persist for incumbent utilities.
Right, and it also does to the. This is another provision in the order, but the order requires transmission planners to consider certain types of grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring being one, DLRs, dynamic line ratings, and others. And I think the order, if I'm not mistaken, the order says that if obviously the local utility would be the one installing that technology rather than competing out that particular project.
Great. And to kind of get back, remerge the branches here to talk about the 7 benefits. It was 12, I believe. And Pamela, whether you had thoughts or Rich about how that has, whether that changed at all meaningfully in the shortening, or if it was just a restating of the same effective benefits.
I think it's largely that some of them have kind of collapsed together. I do, and I think that those are some of the key benefits, although there are some differences, at least from my point of view. I think that the critical ones that they needed to include are all actually captured.
I think from my perspective, it's mostly consolidating some of the 12. The 2 that I think are important to mention that were included in the original list but excluded later on were 1, market power mitigation, and 2, improved liquidity. And I think that, both of those are important, and there's theoretical reasons why we think that having more transfer capacity, it makes the market bigger, it makes it more competitive. It can be part of essentially a market power mitigation strategy to have additional transfer capacity. Same with market liquidity. Power is traded at hubs, and so the more you can kind of get things close to a hub, the more liquid the forward markets are, et cetera. And I think the issue is that both of those are real benefits of transmission, but also very difficult to quantify. And so mandating that all the regional planning organizations try to take a view on that or try to model it is probably a bridge too far, just given the state of our ability to model something like that.
It seems like all of these benefits, though, are hard to quantify, but including 7 of them in the order hopefully advance the consideration of the benefits in transmission planning. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they are all hard to quantify in the sense that there's just huge amounts of uncertainty, right? So there's macroeconomic uncertainty, there's load growth, there's technology costs, et cetera, into the future. I think in a modeling perspective, all of the benefits that ended up getting included in the order are calculated by kind of standard industry tools. So you have a software tool, capacity expansion model, a power flow model, a resource adequacy model, et cetera. You can get these outputs in a straightforward way from existing tools. But the effect on market power mitigation, the effect on market liquidity is I think, it's not going to be an output of an optimization model in the same way that, reduced losses are. So that's, I think, the distinction.
And isn't the idea that you identify what the benefits are and then allocate the cost based on those benefits? Rich is shaking his head no.
If I can,
it's an audio podcast too, Rich. You gotta also say no. Well, enthusiastic. That was a very, very firm shaking.
So this is a very important distinction, and I think some of the detractors of Order 1920 haven't picked up on this sufficiently, I think. So FERC basically said that the regional transmission planners have to consider those 7 benefits, and really to consolidate those 7 benefits down. It's really is it going to cause the power to be cheaper? Is it going to increase reliability, including resource adequacy issues? And is it going to increase resilience? Those are really the 3 major benefits that FERC's looking for. And basically, it said when the regional planners have a set of projects they're looking at, proposed transmission projects they're looking at, to determine whether those projects should move forward or not, then they should assess those benefits and then assess the cost, of course, of building the project and determine whether the benefits exceed the cost in some way, whether it be through numerical terms or other terms, and therefore whether the project should go forward or not. Although again, it doesn't require the region to go forward with the project. It just requires them to assess whether the benefits for each individual project or portfolio projects exceeds the cost. But when the costs are actually allocated, which is subsequent to when the project is, when the region determines to build the project, the costs are allocated pursuant to an ex ante cost allocation mechanism that each, or some other mechanism that either each region determines or the states in a region determines. And it's not at all, it has no relation to the actual benefit. It could be, they could use those benefits, but they could use a whole set of different benefits. It's up to each region to determine that.
The allocation of costs still need to be like commensurate with the benefits from an ex ante approach. So there's certainly going to be interest in, if you're using benefits to identify projects, to think about those benefits for an allocation of cost. But each of the regions are going to have processes that they're required to go through to develop their cost allocation and what they're comfortable with. And there's flexibility provided to that, with that it's kind of built into 1920.
And a region could decide to look at other benefits in terms of cost allocation that it doesn't look at when it decides whether the project should move forward or not.
That is a very important clarification and something that I didn't understand. But you mentioned ex ante, and I had to look this up. So I wanted to just share what I had learned by looking it up, because it's Latin and it means beforehand. I think that's important to explain. The ex ante estimates are based on forecasts rather than actual results. So it's that before the event. And so I think I'm learning more about the timing. So you plan, you assess the benefits. FERC doesn't say you have to build, but there is, that planning with support. And then you assign, I guess, maybe the cost based on the forecast of what you expect that plan to result in. Is that right?
So
the exit. I'm sorry, you go, Pamela. No, you go. I apologize. You go forward.
So the concept of ex ante isn't new. That's not invented by Order 1920, right? Like there is ex ante cost allocation. That's part of what's in Order 1000, and we see that in different regions. And the idea behind it is there is an approach that's going to be known. The approach is known in advance of the allocation of the project's cost. That approach doesn't necessarily have to be just on a forecast. There can be like true ups that change based upon how like power flow changes, if distribution factors are apportioned to it. And I think that was well litigated in the PJM region, for example. But one of the benefits of having an ex ante rather than an ex post, which would be after the fact, is that while all kind of transmission can be litigated, it certainly limits the amount of litigation, and we've seen that work out relatively well. I would say that you'd have to attack the whole methodology that's being used, because when it comes to FERC, for example, what FERC is actually usually approving is whether or not the region appropriately applied the existing methodology, and you can't just say I don't want to pay for this project. You'd have to say they either didn't follow the methodology or the methodology itself isn't reasonable overall. So it would be the ex ante methodology for these longer term projects would likely need to be looking at benefits, but how you weigh those benefits, which ones you're using. There's flexibility that can be provided there, but once if there is an ex ante methodology in place, then it is known in advance that there is an approach for how those costs would get allocated for projects that do move forward under this planning process. To make it a little bit more complicated, there is an alternative that is up to 6 months after the project is selected, the states can actually come up with an alternative to the ex ante methodology for the project selected under Order 1920, if that's what they choose to do. Is that basically right, Rich?
100% right. And just to provide an example, let's say, because I assume many of your listeners are in the Northern Grid transmission planning region. Let's say that Northern Grid said, for anything 345 kV and above, we're going to have 90% we're going to allocate throughout the region and 10% to the local area where the project's located. which is similar to a couple other regions. 45 kV. We'll allocate it all to one sub-region where the project's located, for instance. I'm just making that up. That may or may not be the proposal they come forward with. But that would then apply, except as Pamela pointed out, there's something called the state agreement approach. Let's say the states got together and decided we don't like that for these particular groups of projects. We're going to put forward a different mechanism. FERC allows the states, as long as there's some sort of agreement between the states, to change that allocation if there's some sort of, like I said, agreement or consensus between the states on that. It also could be, in addition to the states, other entities can voluntarily agree to pay for part of the project. For instance, a generator can say, I'm going to pitch in 10% of a particular project because I think it's a good project, and that might make it easier to allocate the rest of the costs.
Yeah. Okay. This is becoming clear for me. Thank you for the clarifications.
Well, let me muddy it up a little bit then, I guess, because back to the original, I think what you're getting at with benefits. So I think, if you solve these planning models, you can calculate benefits from them, and you can calculate a counterfactual, and you can say with some specificity, like, here's how much this region we're predicting will benefit, here's how much this other region will benefit, et cetera. And, you can obviously ask how good those estimates are, but the planning models will tell you, here's what the allocation of benefits are according to our cost benefit analysis. And so some people have proposed, so Bill Hogan is probably the foremost proponent here, is to say, okay, just use that because we have this with this computation. And that's at least one method of saying, we have a something that is roughly commensurate with benefits because we've calculated it. There may be reasons that you don't want to do that, and you prefer this kind of approach where you say we're just going to spread it across the pancake hit across the region. But I think the flip side of that is that you might actually cause more problems than you solve with that type of socialization. If then one state looks at that and says, hey, but those projects really are not benefiting me. Even the models say they aren't benefiting me. Why are you allocating the cost for that?
And so to get to the question, and you're next on this question that I wanted to ask you explicitly, Jacob. Does it do what you wanted? And did you really want it also to move towards this more analytical, technical approach to a modeled benefits, costs get allocated associated with the modeled benefits, or does this do what you want? Do you think it accomplishes the goal of making it less short-term, more long-term, and less local, more regional?
Yeah, so I think from the planning perspective, I think most of the order, like 50% of the text of the order, is just a list of modeling best practices, and it's there's some subjective judgments on, is it 20 years versus 15 years versus 25 years? Is it 3 scenarios versus 4 scenarios? So things like that, where there's, you look at all the comments and you make a judgment based on where all of the market participants land and try to make some subjective decisions there. But it's kind of consistent with the state-of-the-art planning tools that we have available. What are the modeling best practices? So I can quibble with certain things about that, like, for example, I think they say that you should do at least 3 sensitivity analyses, and I kind of think, given the uncertainty, we should do way more than that. We should have a lot more sensitivity analysis than what's in there. Of course, I
want your quibbles. I want more of your quibbles. I want to talk about this one specifically because it was something that I don't know if my own framing of this is different than the standard framing, because they talk about scenario analysis, and I think of scenarios very differently than sensitivities. And I think under 3 scenarios, you could do a lot of different sensitivities to small deviations. So I want to actually talk about this just for 1 minute, Professor Mays. So how do you think, would you want more scenarios or just more sensitivities?
Well, so I take so I'm a modeler, so I want more of everything, right? But
more of everything.
But I take I think it's a very real point that resources are limited. It takes a lot of effort to fully flesh out a plan over a long term, and And so there is no matter what, you have to make decisions about where should you allocate your computational effort and your modeling effort. And so whether 3 scenarios is the right number is I think a judgment call there. The one thing that is that kind of sensitivity analysis or out of sample testing is much easier than coming up with the solution in the first place. And particularly if we're trying to assess, is this going to be beneficial? The classic problem with optimization under uncertainty is you over optimize to the scenario that you created. And so what you want to do is create a bunch of out of sample scenarios and say, how is this going to perform if stuff that we weren't expecting comes? And so there's a little bit of that in the order by saying, okay, you need to create some sensitivity analyses, you need to look at extreme weather scenarios, and need to do some sampling for these extremes, which is very consistent with kind of a modeling best practice for optimization under uncertainty. But it's actually, inevitably it's light on detail, right? There's certain minimum standards that all the regional planning organizations have to meet, but there's a lot that remains to be seen, right? Like how are the planning organizations actually going to construct those scenarios and do those plans and solve those models and say, here's what we're recommending. And so does it do what I hope for? I think is it basically yes. On the planning standpoint, from the planning standpoint, recognizing that you have to make some subjective calls about where to allocate your computational and your modeling effort. On the cost allocation side, you kind of asked, would I have preferred that FERC be more prescriptive about that kind of computational approach? And I don't actually have that position. I think some regional discretion and state discretion. It concerns me that it's less transparent to me, especially as an outside observer. So I like to have the results of the model, and they say this portfolio, we think it's going to benefit this state, and divvy it up that way, and then it's very clear what kind of the underlying, or what one of the underlying reasons why a state might disagree would be. So I like to have that transparency, but I'm also not the one who's been sitting in stakeholder meetings for the last several decades trying to work out these cost allocation mechanisms, and so I can fully buy the argument that some people make, saying, hey, you know what, we get together with all the regulators from all the states in our region, and we hash it out, we figure out something that works for us, and I'm like, who am I sitting in academia to overrule that kind of regulatory and stakeholder process?
If I can add to that, especially the last part of Professor May's point, we talked earlier about the need to have some sort of arrangement or relationship with the states and have the states involved in the discussions. And I think it's because at the end of the day, the states play an important role, because when costs get allocated to them, they may not have the legal authority to disallow the cost from being recovered, but the states have a number of other regulatory tools at their disposal that could, in other ways, get at those costs or show their displeasure with certain cost allocations. That's why it's very important. And I forget if I used this analogy when we first, I was on the last time on your podcast, but it's an old saying of Senator Bumpers, who I used to work for in Capitol Hill, that everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. And it's the same thing with regard to transmission, which is everyone wants transmission to be built, but no one wants to pay for it. And in some way, there has to be a consensus process. And that's why I think FERC gave so much deference to the regions, to hopefully not only through the ex ante mechanism that has to be filed when the utilities submit their compliance filings, but even more importantly, through the state agreement approach, that I think the states have an opportunity to really have a huge role. They have an opportunity to have a huge role in how costs are actually allocated on these transmission projects, especially if regions choose portfolios of projects. which we've seen in MISO work very well, where states might benefit from projects 1, 2, and 4, but maybe not 3 and 5. And other states might benefit from 3 and 5 and not 1, 2, and 4. And they figure out a way to share those costs and benefits. It may not be completely scientific, but it seems to work better than may work better in some cases than using the ex-ante approach.
Rich? Go ahead.
You had a question, Crystal. I'm going to pivot us hard. So yeah.
Okay. Real quick then, Rich, you are working with Western states currently. I just wanted to ask you if you could briefly say what's going on with the state exploration of Western transmission cost allocation frameworks under that CREPC transmission collaborative. You seem to be very involved in it. I think it's important to be transparent about what the states are thinking about and what they are exploring.
So what Pamela mentioned earlier is, and she said, used the term unprecedented, and she's exactly right. States have an unprecedented role here that they never had before under Order 1000. That is, under the Order number 1920, the utilities have to provide for a 6-month engagement process with the states before the utilities submit their compliance filings. So the compliance filings will include how they're going to address the modeling issues and the scenarios and the sensitivities and so on. And the states will have some, hopefully, influence over that through the engagement process, but also in terms of cost allocation. And I think it's a little too, it's too soon because the rule isn't even effective yet. I don't think the rule's been published in the Federal Register yet. But I think that I suspect, I don't want to speak for them, but I suspect the states, as part of this CREPC transmission collaborative, will get together and hopefully participate in not only Northern Grid, but in West Connect and also in the California ISO engagement processes in a manner that I think will hopefully lead to, will smooth the road down, smooth the issues down the road in a way that I think that there'll be hopefully less litigation if they can agree up front on a variety of issues.
And part of that is making sure that people are educated about cost allocation and the different approaches.
Absolutely.
I think that also includes going back, Jacob, to your point about, what's the right number of scenarios or should there be more? I think, 3 is obviously like a floor. And people in the regions can do more than that. But the process for how those are developed, the input that's given, the understanding folks have to what is actually going into that and what do they do with the output of those models to people who are non-modelers in the states. I think that's going to be as important, the likelihood of projects really being selected and moving forward, as well as the cost allocation, having that worked out in a way that is that works for the states, is really understanding what we're modeling when you start looking out and what are the different scenarios and is there buy-in on those are the right scenarios. So I think when you start to see these compliance processes go through that engagement with the states, my hope would be it's not just focused on cost allocation alone, but they're really trying to work out what does this process look like and how are we going to make sure that our seat at the table is really understanding the inputs so that we can know what to do with the outputs.
All part of proactive planning.
Beautiful, Crystal. We're already we're running long, which I love. I knew when Crystal and I got together with brilliant people that our curiosity would take over and this would end up being a very long conversation. But I don't want to get past this question without getting your answer, Rich. Does this do what you wanted? Yes or no? Is this the best rule FERC could have possibly come up with on this or not?
I believe that both Chairman Phillips and Commissioner Clements did a tremendous job of getting this rule out and implement and to the point where it's been finalized now. And absolutely, I mean, you could always quibble with whether it be 5 scenarios or 3 scenarios or whatever it be. But I think that really, this makes the most dramatic change in the way transmission is originally planned in history, I believe. And secondly, it provides an avenue where I think it's going to lead to hopefully a successful approach to cost allocation. So the proof is in the pudding, and we'll look back 10 years from now. But I think we'll say that the commission did the public a big service by getting this rule finalized.
And we'll just say, as fans of yours, that you deserve a lot of the credit for getting this started. So if it accomplishes what you hope for, you deserve your own pat on the back for getting it started. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. But the hard work was getting it finalized, and I appreciate what the commission did.
Yep. But we all know it's about prioritization. A lot of work in our industry and sector is about how do you prioritize different efforts? And you prioritize this. So thank you. But we have more to go. This is not the end yet. You got to thank you in the middle. So I actually wanted to tee off one of the things you were talking about around portfolio projects. And I'm going to pivot actually to your recent paper you wrote with Han Shu, Professor Mays. One of the conclusions of that was that it is likely a portfolio project is more likely to be commensurate, have cost commensurate with benefits, or be more, you'll use better words. I could pull it up for the actual conclusion. But I thought that was a really insightful conclusion of the research. When you run numerical experience, that a portfolio project is more likely to have be more beneficial. You'll use better words. But the next question is largely around what's missing from the rule. And you've done a lot of thinking on this, Professor Mays, and you've run some numerical experiments to try to understand what the sensitivity to investment is. So I want to start with you on if this gets us closer to fostering grid infrastructure investment and deployment, and if not, what's missing? What's the next step?
Well, I think so. We've talked a lot about a lot matters on compliance and implementation. And so like Rich said, ask again in 10 years or 20 years, and maybe we'll have a different opinion or we'll know, but since that paper was mentioned, and since I just said that I don't specifically endorse this kind of computational method of saying just model the benefits and allocate them accordingly. First, I'll confirm that you can, if you try to do things at an individual project level, you get kind of nonsense results because of these interactions and things like that. So you can allocate costs to some, but for an individual project when that region is actually being hurt by the overall portfolio because they're exporting more power, so they have higher prices or something like that. So to me, portfolio makes more sense. The other thing I'll mention though is that one real great advantage of this model-based or direct benefits modeling type of approach is it very clearly distinguishes the public policy related benefits. And so one of the big flashpoints for Commissioner Christie and his dissent was he's concerned that this process will lead to some sort of cross-subsidization where, the states with public policy goals for decarbonization are going to end up shifting cost onto states that don't have those goals. And to me, there's a very direct model-based answer to this where you plug in exactly as the factors in the rule are required. You plug in the decarbonization goals and the preferences and all of that. You solve the model, you figure out who's benefiting, and you can actually map them onto whose decarbonization goals were included. And it's very clear, you can very clearly distinguish between the public policy and the economic and reliability benefits. And so when I was reading the order, I had the exact opposite reaction as Commissioner Christie, where to me, it's very straightforward to see how you would do that computation and distinguish between the states with the public policy goals and those without, and avoid any cost shifts. And obviously, his reading of it was that it was a shell game, and this was all just obfuscation, and the goal was really to shift cost. And I just don't see that in the order at all. So kind of getting back to what's missing is there's clearly a lot to see, like what's going to happen in compliance. How is this going to be implemented? How is this going to actually lead to steel on the ground? And I don't know. Right. I don't think any of us can know for sure, but I think this is certainly, like I said, it's just it's a long list of modeling best practices, and so I hope that I don't know what FERC from their vantage point could have done in a legal way that was better than establishing a bunch of best practices.
So we kind of walked through initially the planning, the permitting, the paying for and the partnerships. 1977 did a little bit more with the permitting. This is on the planning and the paying for. I'm really curious though, because this is all regional, and I'm curious around how much we need interregional and whether that's something, a next step that was not part of, I think, this necessary proposal. But I actually want to come to you next, Pamela, and like, do you think about, what's missing from this, and what's next to get to more interregional work?
So I don't think this was ever intended to tackle it. So I don't think it's missing from it, but I do think that that is a really important aspect to tackle next. I think interregional transmission has proved out time and time again how valuable it can be in terms of avoiding scarcity, really high prices for people. And I think in Winter Storm Uri probably saved people's lives, considering where the lack of it in other places contributed to the tragedy that happened. So I think we are undoubtedly living in unprecedented times in terms of like the tail risks that we used to not really model to in our system. I think we have such greater amount of extreme weather risk than we used to really face, the 100-year storms coming so frequently. And at the same time, we have a society that is more reliant on reliable power than it ever has before. I think the idea that we would just, be out of power for a long time periods, people won't be able to drive their cars. So when you think about the broader benefits of having a grid that's bigger than the weather event or accesses resources that are not facing the same common mode of failure, that is hugely beneficial, but it's still really hard to do. And I think we're seeing some movement, like even, MISO and PJM, with a lot of pressure from their states, have kind of re-engaged on doing some more interregional studies, but those are looking at really small projects right now. And I think unless we have common modeling, unless there's a more holistic process that looks at interregional, I think it's going to be really hard to see any really large projects built that way. Although I think that the continued efforts on thinking about transfer capacity as its own kind of objective has some potential ways forward that doesn't require holistic reforming of interregional planning.
Yeah, I need to pivot to you, Rich. And one of the things that got left out, and I wonder if you think it's missing, is one of the benefits being mitigation of weather uncertainty, weather and load uncertainty. It's one of the benefits that got trimmed, maybe consolidated, but maybe not. Do you think that's missing in this, Rich, or anything else you think may be missing?
So I don't think that's missing. I think if you look at the benefits, and we talked earlier about how they were consolidated, I think there's one of the benefits that is identified is grid resiliency, and then to me that is exactly what guarding against extreme weather phenomena, which is increasing in intensity, but also in terms of frequency, and so that's clearly on everybody's mind, and I think that will be addressed in the regional planning process. You asked what's missing. It's not necessarily missing in the sense that it was intentionally missing or not unintentionally missing. I think the commission put aside how it was going to address interregional transfer capacity or interregional transmission, as Pamela just pointed out, and we've seen a number of proposals actually pending on Capitol Hill to address that, because I think people recognize how important that is. Secondly, the issue of cost containment. The commission had a technical conference on this issue, and I think that still remains on the docket. That docket number, I should say, remains on their agenda. In terms of, there's going to be a lot of money spent in terms of transmission development because we need to get there, but we have to figure out a way to make sure that consumers don't pay for more than they should. They will. They need to, I should say, and that's very important. I expect the commission will take some sort of action there. That's a very important matter to Commissioner Christie, you mentioned earlier. And then third, I'm sorry.
On that one in particular, I think what FERC actually, what they said in terms of not having in the final rule in 1920 related to some of the issues on cost containment and or some of the proposals that were in there related to like construction work in progress, was that they didn't want to look at incentives on like an individual basis, but more holistically. And I think that is another thing that, the commission's like incentive policies at FERC right now are not really aligned, I would think, with, at least from my view, with the planning that that's now going to be required under 1920. So I think there's alignment that's necessary there as well. That would be a different proceeding.
Yep. That was going to be my third point. So perfect. That's exactly right. So I think those are the three items I think FERC is going to need to address going forward.
GQ New Energy Strategies. They're like on the same page, thinking from the same call sheet. You're doing great work out there. And we kind of got to, it sounds like the next frontier of this is interregional. There's a lot of implementation, next steps around implementation of this order and defending the order. As we mentioned, today is like a filing deadline for rehearing. So it sounds like the next new frontier is interregional and then cost containment. Okay, then let's pivot to our Energy System Analogies World Cup. So we've got all of our guests have the opportunity to submit an analogy for the energy system that will go into a list that everybody gets to vote on. And then subsequent, each of you are going to get a chance to vote on prior submissions into our Analogies World Cup field. And our goal is to have a little tournament in the season finale, where we come to one grand analogy of the energy system. And somewhere around here, I've got an insulator that's going to be the Energy System Analogy World Cup. I have to finalize it. So if you submit one, you will be eligible for getting your own. It's a massive insulator. Maybe while somebody tells us their analogy, I'll go get it and show it to you. Anybody here, though, have an analogy?
Okay. Yeah. So as I alluded to earlier, I'm a big sports fan, big Mets fan in particular. And I think the analogy I would use really relates to the 1970. I'll try to be quick on this, but it's hard to explain. The 1973 Mets. The 1973 Mets had a lot of talent, but they were playing awfully. And as a matter of fact, in August, they were in last place, 12 and a half games out of first place. And the general manager, who was, I can't use another term other than to say he was a complete moron. His name was M. Donald Grant. But M. Donald Grant came to the dugout, came to the clubhouse, I should say, and gave a speech to the Mets. And so the players were making fun of him, and they said, you got to believe. And they used that term, you got to believe, the rest of the season. And they not only were they were 12 and a half games out, they climbed out of the last place, and they eventually, on the last day of the season, made it into first place, and then actually beat the Reds and made it all the way to the World Series. My point being is that if you I think back to clean energy, in particular intermittent renewable resources, wind and solar in particular, and think back to not that long ago when there were, people were saying there weren't going to be more than 1 or 2% of the entire generation mix, and we've seen a dramatic increase not only in the Northwest but throughout the country. And obviously some of the technological developments, both in terms of those technologies, bigger turbines, more efficient solar panels, but also energy storage. And I think there's the potential is almost unlimited. And so I would just say for the industry, you got to believe, and it's turning out to be true.
So the energy transition is like the 1973 Mets. We're climbing out of last place.
You got to
except
believe.
For the World Series when they lost in 7 games, but that was because of a bad decision by the manager. But nonetheless, otherwise they almost made it all the way.
Don't manage like a moron. It sounds like in the energy transition would be a benefit that we should all. That's merch right there. Don't manage like a moron. 1973 Mets. Professor Mays or Pamela, did you all bring one?
Well, can I just double down on baseball first? I'd be as a Royals fan, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the 2015 World Series after Rich's invocation of the Mets there. But what I was actually thinking of as a less optimistic counterpoint to the 1973 Mets, one quote that I remember from the 2005 Royals. Buddy Bell was the manager at the time, and this is an awful team. The Royals were pretty much terrible throughout that whole period. And one of the things he said during an extended losing streak was, never say it can't get worse. And so I feel like for those of us focused on reliability and resilience, we have to keep in mind the worst case scenarios, never say it can't get worse, and have that as part of the baseball analogy as well.
So when we do our scenario planning, we got to make sure we have an auto sample for the worst, because It can get worse, and it could probably even get worse than the auto sample that we're using for our worst, right?
Right.
Well, Pamela, anything you want to add? Maybe bring us back optimistic? I don't know.
I don't know that I'm going optimistic, but I'm going away from sports, or maybe sport in a different way. I think my analogy, and I hope it hasn't been used already, would be the energy transition amidst kind of the changing resource mix, growing demand, extreme weather, cyber threats is actually like Game of Thrones. And the different energy resources and their associated challenges are like different houses vying for power and dominance over the realm. And then the extreme weather and cyber attacks are like the threats from unexpected directions, like White Walkers and dragons, political betrayals, and you need to kind of anticipate and mitigate those risks. So I think the power sector, we're seeing shifting alliances. We've seen this over time, like strange bedfellows happening. All these different threats are constantly changing the landscape, and those who are most successful are the ones who can see beyond like the immediate gains and plan for like the future of their realms. So we need long-term vision, like 1920, and balance that out with short-term needs to have like a stable and resilient grid. And we'll see these kind of houses battle it out. Game of Thrones.
I love. We had not had a Game of Thrones yet. That is perfect. I mean, baseball's fine, but Game of Thrones analogy is great. So well done, Pamela. Well done.
All three were great.
All three were great. Yep. Thank you. I'm going to send each of you, as I mentioned, a link to analogies that have been submitted so far. So please vote, because your vote decides the final 8. We're going from, frankly, your job is hard because I think we have 14 analogies now, and you've got to rank them, because that helps us trim down to the top 8. And you'll see crystals in there that the energy sector is transitioning like the eras of Taylor Swift. And I think that's a great analogy, and that's my plug for it. Before we close out, I want to make sure you all feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. Rich, I already mentioned my appreciation for your leadership on this topic, but do you have any final thoughts? Do you feel seen and heard, valued, and appreciated?
I just, again, thank you for inviting us. And this was fun. I enjoyed it the first time, but I even enjoyed it more than the second time. So thank you.
What an endorsement, right, Crystal?
Yes.
Pamela, any final thoughts? Do you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated?
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much. I think it's this is like super fun to get into, and I hope people enjoy digging into the world of 1920 and planning and cost allocation.
I mean, it is right on brand for us to like dig into the weeds on 1920. That's right on brand. Professor Mays is a close friend of the underground. Was this fun for you? Do you feel seen and heard? Always.
Yes. Thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Any final thoughts on transmission planning, or are you just happy to?
I'm happy to leave it there.
Okay.
I can send my student put together a bunch of Taylor Swift analogies. So I'm not enough of a fan of her to know, but I'll forward them. We can add them to the analogy.
And Crystal, what era are we in?
Well, hers. I think Paul and Crystal are the ones. But her reactions were to the most recent album.
I would love to see that. Yes. And Pamela, we're going to follow up with you. We've thought about this so much, and we have talked about it, and Paul's taken it so far. I don't know if we can answer that question. What era are we in? For Taylor Swift, we thought about midnights, those sleepless nights. That kind of makes me think of, it could get worse. But we also haven't really talked about the new album. So Paul, there's so much to explore there.
There is. And so Sherry is the graduate student in Jacob Mays' group and she also shared this with me. I met her at the Macro Energy System Conference, and Taylor Swift has a new song. It's a new single. I Can Do It Well.
I Can Do It With a Broken Heart.
I Can Do It With a Broken Heart. And I thought that was perfect for like managing grid resilience. This is Sherry's quote, we have to manage the grid in resilient conditions under extreme events. And the grid needs to be able to do it with a broken heart. And that was brilliant. I'll get, if you don't mind, Professor Mays, if we can get her permission, we'll include her notes in the show notes for this episode, because it is just our niche wonkiness and niche pop culture crossovers. It was perfect for that. So thank you. Anyway, that is it. To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Crystal, I think I forgot to say thank you to you. I hope you feel valued and appreciated.
Thank you. I always learn more by doing this with you.
Yes, that's exactly right. Roll on, enthusiasts. Roll on.
We started in hard times to bring us all in, into the laughter through thick and through thin, for public power enthusiasts without...
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are our own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery and Crystal Ball, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources, with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.